In this video, we'll walk through the DfE guidance on apprenticeship funding for training providers who receive apprentices from employers after another provider's funding agreement terminates. This guidance applies to apprentices who started their apprenticeship after 1st of May 2017, and it covers everything you need to know about accepting these transfers, including negotiating new prices, managing co-investment, and handling additional payments. We'll explore what you must do before accepting a transfer, how to conduct initial assessments, and the key funding rules you need to follow. When employers or apprentices come to you because their original training provider's funding agreement has been terminated, you can accept the transfer of apprentices to your organization without needing to ask the DfE for permission. However, before you agree to any transfer, there are several important things you must consider and put in place. You'll need to have the right funding agreements with the DfE in place, conduct an initial assessment, and accurately handle recognition of prior learning. You should also encourage apprentices to provide all their learning evidence so far to help inform your assessment and review. When accepting transferred apprentices, you must collect personal information directly from the apprentice to satisfy your enrollment and startup audit trail requirements. Ideally, you should be approved by the same awarding organization, or an appropriate alternative, to deliver the same qualification the apprentice started with their previous provider. This helps ensure continuity of their learning journey and prevents them from having to switch between different qualification structures or awarding bodies. Once an apprentice transfers to you, you must record them as a restart in the individual learner record, not as a new start. You'll also need to put in place a new contract for service with the employer and agree a new commitment statement or training plan. Make sure you satisfy the off-the-job training requirement for the portion of the apprenticeship you deliver as the new provider. You should aim to continue delivering the same program the apprentice started, while working with the employer to review how much funding is remaining to cover the rest of their training. An important rule is that you can only claim the balance of funds remaining within the funding band maximum from the DfE, taking into account funds already paid to previous providers. The funding band maximum applies across all instances of the same program, so you need to account for all previous spending. Additionally, you must ensure the apprentice meets the minimum duration criteria, for example by adding the time they spent on program with the previous provider to the planned duration you identify as necessary to complete their training. There are certain situations where you cannot accept an apprentice. You cannot enroll an apprentice who is already at Gateway because only the endpoint assessment element remains to be delivered and no further training is required. You also cannot include apprentices on your ILR if no learning has been delivered by you, as you would be unable to claim any on-program payment funding or the achievement and completion payment since no learning will have taken place. If an employer has already paid all the co-investment payments to their previous provider, the DfE does not expect them to make those same payments again to you. We'll cover co-investment in more detail later, but the key principle here is that employers shouldn't be asked to pay twice for the same element of training. Similarly, an employer's eligibility for additional payments isn't affected by their previous provider's termination, so if additional payments weren't earned by that provider, you'll be able to earn any subsequent additional payments that become due. Now let's talk about data sharing, which is a critical compliance issue. Providers that have had their funding agreements with the DfE terminated must not share any information about apprentices or employers with any other organizations without written permission from the DfE. If you employ former employees of another provider, they must not share information about employers or apprentices with you. Receiving apprentice personal information from another organization could lead to a breach of your DfE funding agreement, so it's essential you're careful about this. The DfE monitors the destinations of apprentices who transfer following a provider's funding agreement termination, and they will challenge any concerning behavior. This means you need to handle transferred apprentices with the same care and integrity you apply to all learners. Keep detailed records and ensure all your processes are above board and compliant with the requirements we've outlined so far. Before you can agree a new total negotiated price with the employer, you must conduct an initial assessment to understand what prior learning and experience the apprentice already has. You are responsible for assessing the apprentice's prior learning, which means reviewing the evidence in the apprentice's portfolio and comparing it to the occupational competence requirements in the apprenticeship standard. Using the assessment results, you can identify which parts of the training program the apprentice no longer needs, allowing you to customize their training plan accordingly. Following the initial assessment, you'll conclude whether the apprentice has any relevant prior learning and experience that should be recognized. If they do, you must adjust the cost of the remaining apprenticeship training and assessment, as well as the duration, based on the knowledge and skills they've already gained. You'll then confirm with the employer how much additional training the apprentice requires to finish their training and be ready for their endpoint assessment. For further information on initial assessment and recognition of prior learning, you can refer to the gov.uk guidance on apprenticeships. Now you need to review the value of funding remaining. The previous training provider will have already used up some of the government funding available for the apprentice's training. You can only claim the remaining funds within the funding band maximum from the DfE, accounting for funds already claimed by any previous providers. You'll review how much funding is remaining, how much more training the apprentice needs following their initial assessment and recognition of prior learning review, and how much the training and assessment will cost you to deliver. Once you've done this analysis, you'll suggest a price for the employer to consider. Sometimes this price might be higher than the amount of funding remaining within the funding band maximum. If you believe additional funding is required and there's insufficient funding available in the band maximum to complete the apprentice's training and assessment, you need to establish with the employer why their apprentice hasn't made sufficient progress compared to the funding claimed to date. You and the employer then need to agree how they'll pay for the required amount above the band maximum. It's important to understand that additional funding above the funding band maximum will not be made available from the DfE. Any payment required above the band maximum should be paid directly to you by the employer and cannot be funded from their apprenticeship service account. To help you understand roughly how much funding is left, the employer can download previous transactions from their apprenticeship service account to see what other providers have claimed. If they're happy to, the employer can share an extract of this transaction download with you to inform your funding remaining review. To calculate the approximate value of funding remaining, follow these steps. First, subtract the approximate value of funding claimed by other providers from either the funding band maximum or the previous total negotiated price, whichever is the lowest. You can find the funding band maximum for each apprenticeship standard by searching on the Skills England website. If the employer knows the total negotiated price they agreed with the previous training provider, you should use that instead of the band maximum if it's lower, since the funding band maximum applies across all instances of the same program. When apprentices transfer to you, you'll agree a new total negotiated price for the cost of the remaining training and assessment. The employer will need to pay a 5% or 10% co-investment contribution to you based on this new total negotiated price agreed. The co-investment rate you charge will stay the same as what was set at the start of the apprentice's original apprenticeship program. So if they started at 5%, they'll continue at 5%. And if they started at 10%, they'll continue at 10%. If the employer has already paid the full co-investment contribution to the previous provider, they should try to recover that money from their previous provider. Once recovered, they can recycle this money and pay it to you to cover the co-investment contribution based on the new total negotiated price. However, if the employer is unable to get a refund from the previous provider, The DfE does not expect them to pay the full co-investment contribution again to you. The individual learner record will automatically subtract the appropriate co-investment rate from the new total negotiated price you've agreed. You're typically required to show the DfE that you've collected the co-investment payment due from the employer by updating the individual learner record. If you don't confirm you've collected the co-investment payment on the ILR, the completion payment is withheld. This is known as completion payment holdback. To prevent this, you can request to use Learning Delivery Monitoring Code 361 on the ILR to waive the need to record that you've collected the co-investment contribution payment. To request approval to use Learning Delivery Monitoring Code 361, you'll need to contact the DfE using the Customer Help Portal. When prompted about whether this is for a specific organization, select Yes and provide details of the employer's previous provider. When asked what your inquiry is about, select Provider Closure. In your inquiry, give it the title Co-Investment Waiver Approval and include your organization's name, your UK PRN, the apprentice's ULN, the employer's name, their apprenticeship service account ID, and/or employer reference number. Confirm that you've received evidence from the employer that they paid co-investment to the previous provider. You need to store this evidence in your evidence pack for audit trail purposes, though you don't need to send it to the DfE. Using the co-investment waiver means the system will release the completion payment if applicable, but it won't release the shortfall in co-investment funding for you. If the employer has already paid the full co-investment amount to the previous provider, you'll only receive 90% to 95% of the new total negotiated price you agree with them, depending on whether the applicable co-investment rate was 10% or 5%. Finally, an employer's eligibility for additional payments remains the same when their provider's funding agreement is terminated and they transfer their apprentice to you. If any additional payments weren't earned by their previous provider, you can request and receive both the provider and employer payments once the apprentice has transferred to your organization, and you can claim these in the usual way.